Ukraine is strengthening its defenses along the border with Belarus amid concerns that Russia is gradually drawing Alexander Lukashenko's regime into its war. While there are no signs of a new offensive being prepared from Belarusian territory, Kyiv believes Moscow could use Belarus as a springboard to increase pressure on Ukraine and Europe, according to a report in The Guardian. The publication recalled that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had previously spoken of unusual activity in Belarus. Media reports also indicated that Belarus was expanding its infrastructure capable of supporting Russian operations. This includes logistics routes, training grounds, and communications and surveillance infrastructure that support Russian drone strikes in Ukraine. Officials emphasize that there is currently no evidence that Russian or Belarusian troops are massing large forces near the border for an invasion of Ukraine. However, Ukrainian and European officials are concerned that Moscow is increasingly integrating Minsk into its military efforts, particularly through joint nuclear exercises that took place earlier this year. Among those who have expressed concern about Belarus's intentions is former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. In an interview, he stated that Lukashenko's actions today differ from his behavior in 2022, when he allowed his territory to be used for a Russian invasion. "I'm not saying the offensive will begin tomorrow. I'm saying I see something different. A series of events that give reason to believe Lukashenko is preparing for war," Kuleba said. Other experts also point to the rise of pro-Russian rhetoric in Belarus, despite Moscow's war against Ukraine increasingly reaching a dead end. Russia is at a strategic impasse. Russia is facing serious problems on the front lines because we are starting to win this war. Lukashenko's use of such narratives and propaganda is an attempt to somehow explain and justify this situation. Putin is pressuring Lukashenko, demanding closer cooperation and deeper involvement of his military in the war against Ukraine, so Lukashenko is trying to explain this to his audience, stated Ukrainian politician and political scientist Maxim Pleshko. At the same time, other analysts, in particular the director of the Institute of World Politics, Yevgeny Magda, are very skeptical about the possibility that Lukashenko will risk using Belarusian troops to support Moscow. However, the publication notes that if there is a broad consensus among experts in Ukraine and abroad, it is that Moscow, faced with an increasingly deep impasse on the current front, could use Belarus to threaten to expand the geography of the conflict not only against Ukraine, but potentially in a broader European context. The publication's journalists visited the Ukrainian-Belarusian border in the Chernihiv region, in villages that were under Russian occupation for several months in 2022. Now, according to them, workers are installing coils of barbed wire along the narrow road leading to the border, and an excavator is digging new anti-tank barriers. It's no secret that Belarus was a staging area for the 2022 invasion, so there's no trust in Belarus. We've heard Lukashenko make many statements. We're seeing joint exercises, including nuclear ones. We must be prepared for any scenario. That's why we're building fortifications every day. Given the local terrain and what we've already accomplished, in my opinion, it would be nearly impossible for tanks, vehicles, and infantry to advance here. Everything would be destroyed, said a major with the State Border Service of Ukraine, call sign Nissan. According to Nissan, there are no signs of a troop buildup. However, available data suggests that the Kremlin is seeking to further exploit the key air corridor across the border to launch strikes against Ukraine. We are seeing an increase in the number of reconnaissance drones flying from the Bryansk region to collect data on our troops, Nissan said. Local residents have also noticed these trends. At a store in the village of Novi Yaroloviki, located 5 kilometers from the border and with a population of about 300, 55-year-old Natalia Lana and 57-year-old Svetlana Sapakova told reporters that they see Russian drones every day. Last night, 16 drones flew over us, 2 per group. Sometimes they fly so low over the village, at an altitude of about 20 meters, that it feels like I could catch them with my hands, says Natalia. According to Svetlana, local residents can now distinguish between attack drones and reconnaissance drones. She says the Gerber reconnaissance drone has a different sound and color, and it circles the area. Some analysts believe that what local residents and military personnel see at the border reflects the true nature of the risk, not the sudden opening of a new front by Moscow, but a gradual expansion of Russian activity involving Belarus. For European policymakers, recent events in Belarus pose a different kind of challenge. They cement Belarus's hybrid role, stopping short of being a full-fledged accomplice to the war, while at the same time deepening the country's indirect involvement in Russian aggression. For the Kremlin, this approach makes sense. After all, Belarus is more useful to Moscow as a stable base of support in the rear than as an unstable ally on the battlefield, wrote Belarusian journalist Anna Lubakova in a recent report for the Atlantic Council. According to the journalist, as Belarus becomes more deeply integrated into Russia's military efforts, incidents involving its territory, whether drone activity, airspace violations, or other forms of pressure, will likely become more frequent and more difficult to interpret. Institute for the Study of War recalls that in a recent interview, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko voiced a cautious stance on the war in Ukraine, dismissing the possibility of his troops participating in the fighting and acknowledging Russia's limited capabilities on the front lines. During a conversation with Al Arabiya English, Lukashenko noted that Russian President Vladimir Putin understands the unacceptability of involving Belarus in the war. He stated that such a scenario would expose Belarusian infrastructure to attack from Ukraine, and neither Minsk nor Moscow would have the resources to maintain a new line of hostilities along their shared border. Lukashenko also warned that the creation of a new front in the Belarusian direction could lead to a direct clash with NATO. Separately, the Belarusian dictator acknowledged that the Kremlin continues to pursue maximalist goals regarding Ukraine. According to him, back in 2022, some Russian political and military officials urged Putin to seek a peaceful resolution. At the same time, Lukashenko repeated key Kremlin narratives about the supposedly successful advance of Russian troops along the entire front line and the possibility of a complete takeover of Ukraine. At the same time, he softened this rhetoric somewhat, acknowledging the ability of Ukrainian forces to effectively defend themselves. In addition, the self-proclaimed president of Belarus expressed his willingness to mediate in negotiations between Russia and Ukraine with the aim of ending the war. The Institute for the Study of War continues to assess that Russia has de facto annexed Belarus, and that Belarus itself is an accomplice to Russia's war against Ukraine, the analysts noted. As a reminder, Lukashenko stated the day before that Minsk does not plan to participate in a war against Ukraine, as this would create an additional 1,500 kilometers of undefendable frontline for Russia and Belarus. He emphasized that Belarus is vulnerable to attacks on critical infrastructure, and society views conflict negatively. In addition to military risks, Lukashenko cited the close family and historical ties between the peoples, calling the war unacceptable, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's statements about the danger posed by Belarus unfounded and made under Western pressure. Lukashenko also apologized to Zelenskyy for his harsh remarks, attributing them to a response to threats, while calling the Ukrainian president young and inexperienced. Despite the apology, the dictator again resorted to a dismissive tone, stating that Zelenskyy needs to be more careful. Lukashenko once again accused him of ignoring his peaceful advice from 2022, advising him to calm down.